It's Monday, June 8, 1998, 2-ish in the afternoon, Trialogue number 2. Okay.
Family fields. I'm interested, as you know, in the fields of social groups, flocks of birds, schools of fish, and packs of wolves, groups of human beings. And I think all of these have morphic fields, and I think that the morphic fields underlying schools of fish, flocks of birds, insect colonies, help organize the movements of the different animals within them. And the ones in packs of wolves enable them to keep in contact with each other over many miles. I think these fields underlie the telepathic bonds between wolf and wolf, or between separated animals and other separated animals, and the same things apply in the human realm. Telepathy mainly occurs in the human realm between mothers and daughters, sons, parents, children, close friends, lovers, and the great majority of spontaneous telepathic cases do not involve guessing xenocards in darkened rooms, but rather feeling of a sense of emergency by a mother. She calls home and the child's had an accident. Someone feeling a sudden disturbance and suddenly a flash about somebody, feeling they're in great distress or some sense of alarm, and it turns out they've died. This kind of thing. This is true of dogs and cats too. It's mostly to do with these sorts of feelings that telepathy is involved, emergencies, alarms and so forth, rather than with the transfer of visual information for its own sake. Anyway, these fields, I think, underlie all social groups. And in the dog and owner thing, I'm looking at the fields between pets and their owners. But when we look at human families, these fields should also be at work in a human family. It would be a classic example of a social field. In chimpanzee groups, in horse groups, these live as family groups usually, female with children and an associated male. Sometimes young males live free of the social group. In many species they do, but they're very often family-based groups. Horse groups, usually no more than about 5 in wild and feral horses. Wolf packs are usually a female with her cubs and a male, and then some sort of more grown-up wolves, but they're family groups. And so in human family groups we'd expect the same kind of morphic field. Now this is rather a general and abstract kind of consideration, but it would mean that family fields with their morphic fields would have a kind of memory from the families that contributed to them, the father and mother's families of origin would come together in a family. You'd have the husband and wife, the father and mother. You've got always a fusion of family fields coming together into a given family one with their histories and patterns. And in fact, a whole science or therapy or practice of family fields has been worked out in recent years in Germany by what I think the most interesting therapeutic person I'd come across for a long time, Bert Hellinger. Have you heard of Hellinger?
No.
Hellinger. Hellinger's work is extremely well known in Germany and has a large influence, and there's a great deal of interest in his work. He has people following his methods and so on. Hellinger used to be a Benedictine. He then went, or perhaps as a Benedictine, went to Africa, where he spent a long time living with the Zulu. And although he says this isn't the direct influence on his therapy, the sense of the ancestral connection that the Zulu have, and all traditional people have, the role of the ancestors, is a major part of his therapy. Anyway, I'd been to one of his things in London, and I'm meeting him again soon, and I've become quite friendly with him and his followers, because the main theory they use to try and understand what's going on in these family fields is morphogenetic fields, morphic fields. They think it's the different theories or models. They think it's
He's a therapist of human families,
yes,
or what?
Human families. Mm-hmm. That they think this is the most appropriate kind of model. You need a field that links the members of the group together, and there has to be a kind of memory in it. That's what they want, and that's what their family fields are. And morphic fields are that. I mean, there may be other fields that could perhaps give the same effect. But anyway, so that's why I was interested in their work and their interests in mine, and I have been to and I've been very impressed by Hellinger's work. How it works is that you have somebody who comes and they present their problem, they tell Hellinger. This is done in a group with a lot of people in a kind of audience. and they say what their problem is, and why they're upset or disturbed or something. And then he asks them to constellate their family field. And what that means is that he asks them who your mother, your father, how many brothers and sisters, and so forth. Then he says, now please pick anyone to be your mother. And they pick someone from your, and pick anyone to be your father, they pick them, your brothers and so on, but the members of their primary family and their family of origin. And then he asks them to arrange them in order, place them. And when they
on the stage, sitting in chairs and sort of tableau, standing.
This is like a tableau, yes. And when they do that, you get the most interesting things. You see how some people are placed close to each other, facing each other. Some are placed on the periphery, sort of facing away from the rest of the family. And these people can make models. Each one is completely different and quite surprising, these models. I saw 2 or 3 days of this, and a whole series of different family models. And you see these extraordinary patterns, which immediately, for the person there, this is their best representation of the family field from the family they come from. But when you see this, it's a whole gestalt, like a snapshot of a system of relationship, who's close together, who's further away, who's facing whom, who's related to whom. And sometimes this is so obviously it's sort of dispersed and not in relationship, but then the question is, how did, if that one's right out there, facing their back to the rest of me, what's happened, why are they there, not sort of close to the others, and what dynamics are involved in this whole family group. And in order to understand that, he often has to go to the family of origin of the father or the mother in the family field. So then he'll ask the person to constellate the father's family field, for example. And then, they pick someone to be the father, and then if the father had 2 or 3 brothers, the brothers, and the father, the parent, and they have to put them where they were. And sometimes they don't know that well, so they have to guess, but they constitute this field. And it often turns out that the pattern in that first family field is mirrored in the second one. You can just see it in front of you in similar patterns. It sometimes happens that something extraordinary happened in the first field. Say, for example, an uncle drowned as a boy. A 10-year-old boy in that family was killed, drowned in a pond. And then they often leave them out. And he then says, was there anybody in this family that died as a child, or that died at birth? Quite often they say yes. He says, find someone, put them in. And very often the whole imbalance in the field is rectified when the missing member is put in, even if it's, say, someone who committed suicide or a child that died in infancy in a previous family field. Unacknowledged members of the group cause grave distortions to the system, and his method by putting them in creates a whole field sort of can be rearranged. He then rearranges these fields so what would happen if so-and-so was brought in, he asked the person, bring them into there, and then in the father's field ask them to acknowledge the child that died and put them in, and then the child, they say, we acknowledge you, the people actually say we acknowledge you, and then they put the child that died in the right order of children, right in their place between the firstborn, the secondborn, the thirdborn, because the order of birth has a huge impact on these fields and the number of siblings. So here you have a system practically used by Hellinger and his followers, a fascinating thing. And when you see these missing members in the field constitution, then the family of origin of the person, that field is sort of readjusted. To see a whole field pattern and their role within the field pattern is incredibly therapeutic and releasing for a lot of people. They see that a lot of problems they thought were just their problems are actually their relations to this whole field of interaction in the family. So they take seriously a field model of this process, and with these sort of tableau representations one can see this. And so that made me think, whatever the merits or demerits of Hellinger's system, which I think is very interesting and apparently very effective, the idea of making models of family fields seems to me something that one could address in a more general sense, because there would be certain patterns of dynamics you would expect if you have a family consisting of mother, father, and then one child. The simplest ones, 2, 3, 4, 5. What kinds of flows of energies? Some of this would be kind of common sense. So eldest children, and in relation to second children, most people have had 2 children. say that the oldest ones were more trouble as babies, how to deal with the younger ones was somehow much easier to get on with. But then you get this kind of rivalries going up, sibling rivalries and so on. Then families, more complex family fields where you have stepfathers or stepbrothers and sisters, then you get, on his stage, you get these very complicated family fields. What happens in those in real life? Those are common nowadays. So one could make certain models of these fields. One could also see how the balance of energies. If you have a field model like this, and you take someone who's in the model, move them further away in whatever space you've modelled in, and turn them to face out from the rest of the family, what kind of dynamics happens there with the rest of the family? What happens to them in any group into which they enter, any new family they form? What effect does this have? One could perhaps model this kind of thing. So I wanted to suggest that maybe it's possible to make this family field thing more scientific, investigate it further, make models, and in some way perhaps come up with tests or empirical studies that could further the science or investigation of family fields.
Well, that certainly sounds very interesting. I'm not sure I understand to what degree the use of the word field is justified here. And do they think of like an extended spatial field, like the gravitational field or something is associated with the family, and the individuals have a field like vibrating aura or something? Or does it just mean the field in a general sense that could be described, let us say, just by giving for any two individuals in the family some strength of the connection, plus or minus or something, that would be represented in the tableau when the actors are placed on the stage by the geographical distance to them or something, so that bringing one member in closer would correspond in this model to just strengthening the bandwidth of the communication channel, or the positivity of the regard, or some other like simple parameter. That would be more of a connectionist model, with like a undirected graph with nodes and links and so on. Is it like links between the people could be just represented by a number, or would it be essential in order to understand the experiences of Helena to actually have a kind of extended three-dimensional spatial field around each individual that has memory and so on?
Well, maybe a connectionist thing with nodes would be an adequate model. But then you could say that the connections, the nodes, you could just sort of draw a line around the whole thing and say this was a set of connections or something, which would be perhaps just a different way of trying to model the field. You see, the connections, insofar as you say there's a connection A, B, and it has a given strength, you're presupposing an invisible bond between people that would work when the other person was in the next room, at the very least. And therefore you're proposing a bond whose reality is not physical in the normal sense. It may be mental, emotional, psychic, whatever word you choose, but it's not sort of smell, touch, hearing. Those are involved if you're in the same room. And so the advantage of the field model is it frees you up from thinking that the connections must be normal face-to-face communication. They can still exist even if you're apart.
I see. So the family field, the flock, the school, and so on is kind of extrapolation backwards of psychic pets into more the psychic bonds in the wild.
Well, I think that the bonds, even between members of the family, when people go away and they want, like me, I'm attached to my family, so from here I feel a strong need to ring up my children to speak to them as they're going to bed, even though I'm 6,000 miles away. That bond is a strong bond for me. And for most people, if they're near us, these bonds are not severed by getting on an aeroplane. So whatever model you have of the connections have to be of such a nature that they still persist.
I'm suggesting to whatever the model is to have the same model as the model we have for the psychic pets, because ethologists, or say these therapists, like the animal equivalent of Hellinger, that analyze cats, for example, they describe the relationship of the cat to the owner person as a form of the relation of the cat to the cat's mother that's been replaced The cats, even as they age, regard themselves as kittens, as it were, with their owner as the mother cat. And the way they play and rub against you and so on are derived behaviors from what the cat version of Helen would describe as the family field on the cat level. And therefore, if we are, as we have been thinking about mathematical models for the field that describes the attachment of the cat and owner, then we would be tempted to use the same model for the family field, in the human family, for example, or flock sheep and so on. And that would be then some kind of, well, telepathy is the word, I think, or a non-specific communication channel between people or animals at a distance.
Yes, although telepathic communications wouldn't need to be passing between it all the time. Maybe a connectionist model would be fine, as long as you leave open the nature of the connection, so that the connection doesn't have to be presupposed to depend on normal sensory communication. And probably in
a neural net, if you took one of and it was capable of, say, parsing natural speech or something, and then you took one of the nodes out or broke one of the connections, and wouldn't be able to do that anymore. So this the connectionist model might be adequate for modeling this Hellinger strategy of bringing in the missing sibling or something, replacing the node and the connections which make a functional unit.
Yes. Or what would have happened is where before the sibling died, the family field had a different structure because it included that sibling. If the death of the sibling changes the field, but his point is unless it's acknowledged, and unless in some sense the ancestors are acknowledged, and unless the dead sibling is acknowledged and recognized within the field, their presence within the field is recognized, their unrecognized presence can cause terrible disturbances. So something to do recognizing a kind of virtual node in the field.
I don't see how that would be, I don't know how to model that. How could that be important? What does this recognition consist of? So you are a fish. Okay, now I've recognized you as a fish.
They're coupled oscillators, and the family thing works because people really are complex chemical systems with genetic affinities. You could even suppose a kind of physical mechanism. I mean, they are coupled oscillators that impart their waveform to the local space, which encounters the waveforms of these other oscillators, which are very similar to them physically, more similar to them than any other person or thing. And so there's a kind of entrainment. Often the things are these feeling-toned, something has happened to someone, or I should call someone. So it indicates they are like coupled oscillators.
So the recognition, the non-recognition means, well, the oscillators are coupled, and therefore this one is, and then it's not understood because we're not aware of. My father's sister Carrie died when he was young, so she was never even a person. She was not real. If I had interactions with a place in some structure, or say our family field where she belonged but I didn't acknowledge it, then I would always be confused about what's going on in my life, something like that.
Yes. Because the whole structure of the family field is, you see that if it had, or you see there's a kind of memory in these fields, and so the field and the dynamics of the field are influenced by the memory.
Oh, I see it, yes.
Of the person who was there but no longer there. And so the memory is actually working in the dynamics of the field because all these fields have this kind of memory. But if you don't recognize it's there, you don't understand what's really going on in the interactions, and you're always in the dark as to why certain puzzling conflicts or whatever, or suicides. Yeah. There are cases where, amazing cases, where you get members of families, young people, commit suicide in a way that mimics the unacknowledged death of an ancestor, like suicide by drowning, when an ancestor one or two generations before has committed suicide by drowning, but they've never been told about it because it's never acknowledged. And you get these extraordinary patterns that repeat, sometimes literal ones like that, other times sort of morphed ones.
Well, maybe we have to think of different models for the same thing, so that there'd be a model like a connectionist diagram of a family as it were, and then there's another drawing for the family as I see it. And that if I haven't acknowledged my Aunt Carrie, then in my model of the family, there's nothing there.
That's right.
But in this other model of actual interactions and so on, it is there. Maybe you need a directed graph where the channel between you and me, for example, would have two lines. One going that way, as when I speak or send you a message, and another one going this way.
Yes, they'd have to do. The connections would have to have sort of directed both directions.
So there could be, in the case of a family member who's not acknowledged, that there's a directed line from that one to me because I'm receiving but not knowing,
yes.
And then I'm sending nothing back because I'm not acknowledging.
Yes.
So the acknowledgement of a missing family member would just consist of the addition into the model of one link going back.
That's right. That would be enough. And in his therapeutic workshops, where he does this with the family, and their whole therapy of the particular person may last half an hour, 3/4 of an hour, really constellating these fields. And then in these things, he asks the person to come, say that the members of the family there's somebody representing them, you see, in the family field. There's somebody standing in for themselves. They're sitting outside it with him.
Oh.
So say that it was your family field, you choose someone to represent you.
Oh, I see.
So there'd be Ralph in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're sitting back and telling him, you now see Ralph in relation to us from outside. And then you see how
it's remodeling.
It's remodeling.
Yes.
And then you see the other ones, and he readjusts the field and puts in the absent or unacknowledged members. And then he asks the members actually standing there to acknowledge the unacknowledged ones or whatever. And then he asks you to go and stand in the position of Ralph in this remodeled field and turn to the unacknowledged one and say, you are my aunt, I acknowledge you. And turn to the others and so on, and experience that new constellation from within. And this has a dramatically changing effect on family fields. It brings them to consciousness, it recognizes these things, and the acknowledgement is done, and it changes them. So any model of the fields, you see, would mean the kind of thing you were saying would still apply. You'd have a model of the fields, as well as you have a map of its perceived today. Mm-hmm. And if you're able to bring about the remodel, or at least bring your model of the field into much more into place connection with what the field actually is, or was, so then this has a therapeutic effect.
This is the opposite of institutional therapy, where people go into a corporation, for example, which has an actual structure, and then the directors have their model, and instead of changing the model to fit the actuality, they change the actuality to fit the model.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But they're in a company where you can actually have a board model, a flow diagram of power. I mean, these are sort of artificial organizations. But family organizations although there's a kind of archetypal model, like the nuclear family model or something like that, although there are sort of idealized models, socially approved and recognized, each family is different, and each is different in its own way, to paraphrase Tolstoy. Anna Karenina. Every happy family is the same, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So there's a sense
out of shape, as it were, as
yes,
a framework.
The field is somehow distorted or whatever. So his model, any model made would have to take into account those two things. So it's a question of how far can one just say, well, this is an interesting therapy, it's just one among many, and it's just that this is its particular trip. But how far can one take says to the idea that family dynamics are not an arbitrary invention of having there an obvious reality, and we don't have adequate models for these family systems, nor the influence of ancestors within them, which my interest in morphic resonance makes me very keen on. In fact, that there must be this historical memory, habit dimension.
Well, then the network can be extended indefinitely. It's simply that people outside the family, but in the neighborhood or in the past, are weakly coupled.
Important teachers in primary school.
Yes.
Things like that.
That sort of thing. They're weakly coupled, yes.
Yes.
And then you can have the way that you could then extend this. Arnold Mindell is the person who's pioneered this model in non-family groups. Are you familiar with his work?
Mm-hmm. I am.
you know, on a window. But in his book, The Year One, he talks about the modelling of social groups, how you have a social group and that each social group is a kind of organism, and therefore there will be different roles taken up by different people within the group. And in lots of groups, for example, there will tend to be somebody who's a grumbler or a complainer, and who sort of focuses and vocalizes the sort of grumble, takes on the role of making complaints, which other people in the group might be too shy or too restrained to make, but somehow they're made. And then they can also project onto the grumbler a kind of negativity or hostility. This is a dynamic that happens within groups, and quite often, if one grumbler leaves the group or is expelled, someone else has to take on that role of being a grumbler. So he has a kind of field theory, what I'd call a field, I don't know if he calls it a field theory, but I'd call it a field theory of groups, which is less interesting than Hellinger's in the sense that Hellinger has this family dimension, this time dimension, with innumerable in examples. There's hundreds of videos of his doing this with different family groups. You can see one after another of these groups before your eyes on video. They're very interesting. But Mindell is a more abstract theory based on him working with groups in therapy sessions or in town meetings or workshops. We've got 30 people for a few days. It doesn't have the same kind of historical depth, but it's still dealing with the same kind of group model.
Well, the idea of memory, then Hellinger's interest in memory in the field concept has to do with having the ancestors in the tableau. Is that right?
Yes.
Well, how do you understand the influence of an acknowledged or unacknowledged ancestor, generation or two back on this, the part of the family unit that consists of the currently living members? How to understand that? If it was, say, 2 generations back, you've never met them, what's the difference?
Well, because,
how do you understand it?
Well, because, say, when you have a partner, you get married or not married, as the case may be, you have children, you then have a family field, and assuming the parents are together, your expectations of the way you behave to your children, no one's ever trained you how to raise children. It was never mentioned at school. So how do you know how to treat your kids? Well, the only model you've got is either looking at friends doing this, but the one that runs deepest for you is what happened in your own family. And so you bring to the situation a kind of memory of the whole dynamics of your family of origin. And the same goes for your wife or your partner or the mother of the children. She brings to it the dynamics from her whole family of origin. You and she then have different expectations of how the family is going to work, because you've got 2 different kind of fields, and she may expect quite different things of you and of the way you treat the children and of the kids than you expect of her and of the kids and so on. And this can either lead to some kind of compromise. In fact, over time somehow it has to accommodate in some way, but it can also lead to a lot of conflicts. There are different models and expectations. So you bring these fields with you, as it were, unconsciously, because they're the fields in which you were in that group there with the sort of field pattern. You're now in a new family group, and you bring that field pattern in, and it sort of fuses with that of your partner. But that's the only, you can learn from other models, you can know other families, you can live with other groups, but basically you bring it with you.
So then do you think cross-cultural marriages are more fraught than marriages within class and cultural domains?
Well, that would be an empirical question. One would predict that there would be certain kinds of problems. Say you take marriages between English people and Indians or Pakistanis, then you could do a model, the Hellinger type model of the Indian family field. You could interview Indians, look at Indian family structures. They'd probably have quite different sort of expectations and field patterns from the people from nuclear families growing up in suburbs in England or America. And if that's the case, you could actually predict what would happen when you put these two, what kinds of conflicts are likely to result, what kinds of expectations the man and woman from these different kinds of backgrounds are going to have within this. And you could talk to people who deal in marriage counselling with mixed marriages and see whether these are indeed the kinds of recurrent problems they encounter. So you could, by talking to sociologists, social workers and people who actually deal with dysfunctional families of various kinds, or functional families. You could. This would be an empirical study on family dynamics from different backgrounds. So you could actually approach it all. You could make models, and you could actually test them, because there are different kinds of families and fields coming together.
So I think the model then of the family field would have to consist of more than the nodes and the connections and so on. I mean, the creation of the tableau with the patient as the director includes not only where the actors are standing, but also which direction they're facing.
Yes.
And maybe their posture or any kind of body language representation, facial expression, things like that.
Yes. Well, it doesn't usually. It can involve posture.
Because when we think of animal behavior in the sense of how you raise your children and so on, and there are many, many attributes of a node, an individual member of the family, and their attitude of servitude, or their willingness to sacrifice, compromise, and all these things that we know varies from culture to culture. And so on. They call the roles of the division of labor of the mother and father, and so on. The father drives the other species of birds away from the nest, and so on. So some kind of modeling or even a simple representation of these behaviors would have to be attached. Otherwise, the model would be too simple to really indicate the difference between different generations and people from different families, coming from different family groups, marrying, and so on.
Yes, well, it might help.
The geometry wouldn't be enough.
Well, it might help in starting these models with different species of birds, for example, where you've got more standardized patterns and where you can actually observe what happens. Because there is a division of labor with birds, and say a gander will defend the nest of the goose and young. Some birds, cuckoos, do it a totally different way, of course, and the baby cuckoo is like a pathology in the nest of other birds. So it's all different patterns among birds in the division of labor, but they're fairly consistent within a species. So if one had a model that would work for these, the family fields are more complicated. Human family situations are far more complicated than those of many animals, and the beauty of looking at bird families is that you could have 20, 30 different kinds of behavior already documented by naturalists. The family life of different birds, the number of little birds they have, the way they teach them to fly, whether they have social groups or not, like flocks. Some birds have flocks, some don't. There'd be a lot of scope. Anyone who could come up with a good model would have a large amount of natural history at their feet as a territory to explore with this modelling technique. Because right now, the kinds of models that ethologists have of groups are not terrible. Well, their focus has been distorted by the Richard Dawkins type people, where it's all the selfish genes and it's seen as individual competition and struggle. And maybe that perspective has something to offer to this modelling process, but it hasn't led to any kind of emphasis or attempts to model the dynamics of these groups very effectively.
The other thing you have to take into consideration is a family is an organism evolving through time. The arrangement, the tableau, is a snapshot in time. Mm-hmm. It also, one could assume it's the patient or the client's relationship to their family at the present moment. But on the other hand, if you're going to bring in ancestors, is the ancestor influencing the field as a child, as a middle-aged person, as an elderly person? Did their influence on the field change through time? And then there seems to be sort of a dichotomy. There's a static now, but it's being modified by a shifting past as these ancestors exert differing influences on the situation depending on where in their own life history they are.
Yes, and in some tribal cultures, like the Sora in India, this is the kind of thing the role of the ancestors actually being documented by anthropologists. There's a whole body of anthropological data here. There's the Sora, where my friend Piers Vitebsky was an anthropologist, and I visited him in the field in Bihar. in Orissa, in Koraput district of Orissa. He was living in the Sora village. He was living with Shaman. And they had a whole very complicated doctrine about what happened to you when you died. Say you died by suicide, you went to the sun. If you died of smallpox, you went to a kind of leopard spirit. And there were different groups, and the ancestors who died of that all went to the same place, so you were with them. And you wanted to get the living into your group when they died, rather than someone else because you wanted to be with them. So there were always competing death spirits, different modes of death, containing ancestors, competing for the living. And the best way to deal with this is to make peace with them, and to make offerings. Every year there's these buffalo sacrifices for the ancestors. So if you give blood and appease the ancestors, then they'll be happier and they won't feel so needy, and they're not going to try and grab you so much, and so you buy them off. But after 2 or 3 generations, their individual identity, their names begin to fade, and they're sort of liberated over time from that sort of obsessive thing until the souls are sort of set free, at which time they become butterflies. So when you see butterflies flying around in the forest from the village, these are the liberated souls of distant ancestors whose influence is no longer particularly important in this whole economy of death and recruitment.
Well, this is the memory model for the conspiracy theorists.
Yes, except that there's lots of different... It's like a competing... It's not so much conspiracy... Well, there are sort of competing conspiracies.
Yes.
And there are certain stones you can trip over in the forest. There are certain ones that catch people who stumble and make you stumble in the forest. But you have to be on good terms with the ancestors. And what being on good terms with them above all means acknowledging them. It means in the sacrifice of buffalo blood that you name and acknowledge the key ancestors. You acknowledge all the dead in your lineage. And if you miss anyone out, they're going to be angry. And if they're angry, that means trouble. So this is their cosmology, the way they see it. And each tribe, each group has its own theory of the ancestors. The Japanese and Chinese, especially the Chinese, have an elaborate sense of the role and importance of the ancestors, with all these offerings they make of paper houses and whatnot. And I think if one were looking at this empirically in the human realm, I mean, one would perhaps have models for different species of birds, but coming back to the human realm, to compare the dynamics, which you could do partly from anthropology and partly from modern sociology, of, say, Chinese families, typical Chinese families where there's a high degree of acknowledgement of the ancestors, with modern American families or Western families, fragmented, dissociated, chaotic, where there's a very low degree of acknowledgement of the ancestors, and see what kinds of patterns occur there. And then you could look at Chinese Americans who may have abandoned all the ancestor worship thing and just assimilated to mainstream American society. Do they have particular qualities, or do they just become like Americans?
Well, they stumble a lot.
They stumble a lot.
They must, because there are a lot of angry ancestors who are accustomed to a greater degree of...
Well, you'd expect that, you see, but then maybe they go on acknowledging them. A lot of the Chinese are very traditional. So, there's a whole field of research here, the role of the ancestors, because every culture has its own way of dealing with them, and its own way of acknowledging them. In the Christian tradition, the festival of All Hallows and All Souls, Halloween is the eve of All Hallows, November the 1st, and All Souls Day, November the 2nd, is when requiem masses are offered for all the dead, all the departed, in which you can particularly hand in the names of particular ancestors or particular people who died, have their names read out of the requiem mass. So I do this myself. So there's an acknowledged social form in our culture for acknowledging and naming the ancestors in a traditional ceremony. So there are great variations in our own culture between the degree to which people within different families and traditions acknowledge the ancestors. The Roman Catholics do it more than the Protestants, because of this phenomenon of requiem masses and the observance of All Souls Day, which Protestants don't observe. So it's a rich field for investigation, you see, in sociology, anthropology, model building, etc., but as yet more or less unexplored.
Do you think these ideas could be extrapolated to non-human families with any degree of that you would learn anything useful?
Yes, it would have to be exactly the same, or perhaps simpler. Like bird families, maybe all the behaviors that we could quantify are ones that ethologists had been traditionally observing, and they might have missed a lot of things, like the role of the ancestors among birds. I don't think they ever noticed. Was the ancestral knowledge? Are there any, bird families with 3 generations? And
I guess you could ask, what is a family? Does an insect have a family?
Well, termite certainly does, on the
Social
grandest
insects
scales,
do.
yes.
But for instance,
well, a social group, it wouldn't have to be a family. Whatever group that you can observe, like you observe a school of fish, you might not know the ancestry or the kinship diagram, but if you could quantify the observables, whatever ethologists observe about birds, the gander is aggressive and attacks other birds, so that would be a number from 1 to 10 of aggression. Then the mother nourishes by going and getting food, chewing it up, spitting in their mouth, and that be nourished is another parameter. So whatever the ethologists observe more or less defines the model that they have of bird groups or families, and likewise whatever the species have been observed. I don't think there is any mathematical modeling effort that's been going on among ethologists or anthropologists for that matter.
but really this theory is saying that it's genetic similarity that impinges on the strength of the bond.
No, I veto that.
It may or may not.
So twins would then be in a special position.
Well, they are in a special position, as traditionally acknowledged and revealed by modern twin research. They are. But genetic similarity is, you see, the mother and the father, the children have a genetic similarity to the mother and the father.
Right.
The mother and the father have no necessary genetic similarity. And it's also possible for members of a pack of wolves, a wolf, a male may join a group. So you do have interchange between the groups, and exogamy, marrying to a group outside the familiar group, is the rule rather than the exception. So although at least one member of the group, the father or the mother, is going to have a different, unrelated genetic nature. So it's not a necessary feature of these bonds to have genetic similarity. They may or may not have it, and it may be they're stronger in the social insects, where you've got all these castes of workers derived from the queen and sharing half the genes of their sisters with each other. They have a great many genes in common. Yes, this may give a kind of more telepathic type connection between them, but I wouldn't put genetics as our key. It's not going to help us much in this particular
So can
discussion.
you imagine a strong link between a person and their great-grandfather's second wife, to whom they have no relation other than that?
Oh no, if it's the second wife, it would be relatively irrelevant. And Hellinger, if one were doing this modelling, one would look at what he thinks. It's the family of origin. What would matter is the time when your grandfather was born.
Uh-huh.
His family of origin, it may later include, when he's 12, 15, his father marrying again or something, but it would be the origin field you look at first.
I see.
And these later ones have relatively small effect. So, they've already got their ideas about what weightings you'd give to these different people in drama. But the difference between birds and people is that the general pattern of a bird family is given instinctively. It's by a morphic field, I would say, with such a deep and strong morphic resonance. You've got a kind of basic pattern that the whole species lies within. And if you have a deviant family, subsequent ones would get morphic resonance from their own deviant family of origin, but they'd also get resonance from sort of a huge runnel in creative family life. Now, in the human world, where there's no genetically determined family structure, but because it's cultural, a great deal of human cultural evolution is sort of decoupled from genetics. It's the difference between Italian families and Jewish families and English families and American families and stuff, and families in New England and California is not particularly genetic, it's cultural. And the fact that families have changed through divorce, etc., over the last 100 years, much smaller family sizes. 100 years ago, most of our ancestors would have had 6, 7 siblings. Mine did. Now, you've got much smaller nuclear families, higher rates of divorce. It's changed, and so it's not genetic. It's much too quick. So genetics doesn't really help us much. And that's why in the human realm, the only model that you can rely on is not a genetically inherited model, because you don't have that, whereas animals do. But there's the cultural experience in which you grew up, and the cultural models around you. So that's why I think that although one could have a certain class of models that would handle human families and bad families, the human one's always going to be much more complicated.
Much more complicated, because you have to model the cultures as well. So maybe birds are easier because they're monocultural in a sense, but culture is also simpler.
But once a class of models had been built up in one field, it would be a matter of extending it, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's why it would be easiest to start with the simplest models, simplest cases, and then easily extrapolate upward until you get to human species and eventually to whales and so on.
Is it a metaphor? I mean, it's a conceptual metaphor.
The field.
Yes, it doesn't have any dynamics of its own.
But maybe field.
The model that you make would have the dynamics.
Yes,
A magnetic
there's
field.
nothing there to measure. There's nothing there to interfere with. This is a way of describing a situation.
Or modelling it.
Yes.
Like a magnetic field's a way of modelling magnetic fields.
Well,
Maxwell had a model.
Field in this sense means extended wavy thing that an object would have like a sphere of it around it or something. But I'm not sure, when you originally started speaking about morphic fields and so on, were you thinking of something like the magnetic field, or were you thinking of more abstractly as Heidegger uses it in the context of the family field?
Well, I was thinking of something more abstractly, but I think that these fields have a kind of ontological reality comparable to that of electromagnetic fields.
I always thought of it more as the electromagnetic field, that kind of field. When I first read your works many years ago.
The primary metaphor is the magnetic field. I mean, that's what gives you a sense of the field.
Yeah.
But if you look at the kind of physics that would be most appropriate for describing these fields, it's not electromagnetism, it's quantum field theory.
Oh, it's not that either. It's the gravitational field. It's just the field concept, an extended thing that's represented by a continuous real number variable of defined on a coordinate system.
Well, no, I had a discussion with David Peace and Basil Hiley recently in London. We had a whole day we were discussing this question. And Hiley is Bohm's principal follower. He worked with Bohm for many years. And we were discussing, we went at great length about this nature of fields, and with one distinction they made for me which was very helpful was that these quantum fields, say you've got two photons whizzing apart from the same atom, and you measure the polarization of one and the others immediately, instantaneously, by entanglement or non-locality or non-separability or Bell's theorem or the EPR paradox, the other immediately has the opposite polarization. That the model you have for the connection of those, the quantum function that describes them, is, until the moment you measure it, it's a kind of private field. There is a connection between the two, one here and one here. But it's not like the connection between a magnet and another magnet, or between the source of light, the sun, and the sink, the earth, where the light goes in. It's or the gravitational field between the earth and the moon. It's not that at any point in between you can go and measure the strength of that field, because that field only affects those two protons. It's a kind of private field that links them, that's not determinable by measurements in between.
But isn't the very notion of field carry with it an idea of inclusivity of space and time? In other words, why call it a field at all? Why not just call it a connection?
Well, you could just call it a connection, but I think quantum field theory does have a notion of fields underlying this, but they're not in normal space and time. Ralph would know that.
It's a completely different use of the word field, and it is private in that the particles have a field. I mean, there only exist fields, and then their interpretation is as particles is just a kind of interpretation, but that the universe consists of like so many of these fields of interaction, as it were, and their variables are not spatial it's a completely different model. It couldn't be anything more different than the use of this word field in the quantum domain, the use of the word field in classical physics, for example. So I'm extremely suspicious of the application of quantum mechanical concepts in the arena of psychology, consciousness, sociology, and so on.
Yes, but you see, we've got two field models.
Much fuzzier than the face on Mars.
All right, but we've got two field models in physics. We've got the sort of classical electromagnetic field models with continuous fields, and never
measurements can be carried out at any point in the field, and it can be discovered to be there.
But you see now, David Bohm's model of quantum theory, which you referred to earlier, the one that involves, if you can get rid of the non-causal indeterminism, but what he substitutes for indeterminism is what he calls a quantum potential, which is a field, an invisible field of quantum potentials that shapes what happens to different particles, and which has as a part of its very nature non-locality. This quantum potential means something can happen here or it can happen there. But the field itself is in some kind of higher dimension, which he calls the implicate order. And it's the realm of possibilities, which quantum fields are defined in terms of fields of multidimensional fields of possibility, which are not the same kinds of things. Now, morphic resonance involves what one might call non-local effects. That makes me interested in the only branch of science which has non-locality as part of its normal structure. And so the question is there anything in this quantum stuff with its non-locality that relates to all these other instances? A mother knowing about a child, a pigeon separated from its flock many miles away and being able to come home and so on, a father separated from a son and having a telepathic link between them. These are kinds of non-locality. They're system parts of the same system, still remaining connected at a distance. Is this a mere analogy? Or does it show us that there's something deep being revealed by quantum physics? Not that you can explain all things in terms of existing quantum theory of particles, but that they've stumbled on something in quantum theory which is common to systems of organization at many levels of complexity. And that there's therefore more similarity between the quantum models of fields and these phenomena than classical Maxwell-type electromagnetic models of fields. But these are two quite different sorts of fields, and the gravitational field's different again. So which field model? We maybe need a quite different field model, and we don't necessarily have to have any of those, but it would have to include what quantum field theory has. I think the model, what it has in common with that's interesting, is the private field, the fact that if you have a tremendous emotional link to Finn, say, and if you could pick up telepathically messages from Finn, it's a kind of private field. It affects you and Finn, but I wouldn't expect in a linear line between you and Finn to go along with a meter and measure it. No, so the private field aspect is interesting, the non-locality aspect of it is interesting, and therefore it may be a better model, or at least it frees us up from thinking we've got to have a model that's only based on the electromagnetic pattern.
Well, it seems to me that a great deal is lost that way because, for example, there's no natural model for communication. In the case of a mechanical field, like two billiard balls are connected by a spring. If one billiard ball shakes, then the vibration travels down the spring to the other one. This is electromagnetic photons, all kinds of communication in the world are modeled in more or less the same way through a vibration-like disturbance of a sort of mechanical vibrating field, and that's convenient because we're thinking of communications. Actually, we're trying to model communications in the family field. It's the communications between different members of the family that make it happen. That's where the activity is.
But in a quantum field, like the Einstein-Rosen-Podolsky thing, like if you measure the polarization of this photon here, and immediately the other one has the opposite polarization, although it's not communication through photons, because it's twice the speed of light, if they're moving apart, it's considered to be instantaneous. Although the word communication is denied to this, and the correct usage is instantaneous correlation. If a member of the family dies, and another member of the family immediately feels some kind of perturbation. Maybe it is more like that quantum effect than like a series of wobbling springs moving through the intervening space.
Seems like a long shot to me.
Part of the problem is that physical models break down when prosecuted to quantum mechanical levels. For example, when you stand on a hillside at night and look at the stars, you see all the stars in the sky. Well, if you move 3 feet and look again, you still see all the stars in the sky. The implication of this is that wherever you stand in the universe, you can see all the stars that can be seen, a great many stars. Well, what you're seeing are photons. Well, do photons from all the stars fill every cubic volume of space, no matter how small? Or are we asked to believe that if you were shrinking, you would finally reach dimensions where the stars begin going out because there isn't room in the space you're in for the photons to occupy that space? Quantum physicists tell us no, there is no size so small that it causes the stars to go out. But this seems to imply then that photons, which are real things, from every star in the universe can crowd themselves into another real thing, a physical volume, no matter how small. And this generates contradictions which point out that even trying to use language about these things somehow betrays them. What we think they're saying, they aren't saying, because if they're really saying what we think they're saying, they generate absurdities such as that. I mean, think how many photons there must be in the universe if you can see every star from every point. And what is a photon? That an object 100 million light years away can fill all space, right down to the nanometer and below volumes, with photons. This is
William wouldn't be so keen on this one.
This is orthodox physics, as I understand.
Well, that's the corpuscular view. And I think many metaphors we've shared over the years, like the owner and the pet are separated in space. There's kind of an elastic dough in between them that gets stretched out, and the vibrating around morphic, the resonance. Okay, like resonance is good. It doesn't make a great deal of sense in quantum mechanics. Resonance is a metaphor that comes from the acoustic realm. I like the acoustic realm. We are connected by air, an elastic medium. We snap our fingers here. A sound wave goes down. Another sound wave goes down. They can amplify or they can interact additively or destructively depending on their frequencies and so on. These metaphors we've used over and over again that I thought they were love. And now I find out that it seemed to me that we were using this particular metaphoric language to cover a lot of ground in the embryogenesis and in the social sphere and the emergence of behavior and the evolution of the mind and so on. That was more or less based in this kind of mechanical meaning of concept associated with the word field, resonance, and so on. It has extended. And quantum mechanics is nothing like this. It has a very, very complicated model. I mean, it's good in experience. It has completely different concepts, and that's good. And there are realms in classical physics where you have two different models, the quantum mechanical one and another one, and they're complementary or supplementary models, and that's useful. But if it's already such a complicated model for a single particle, then what are we talking about with the state of consciousness and extended mind, or the communication between animals of the same species and communication between animals of different species, and so on. We don't have a rich enough vocabulary of metaphors from quantum mechanics to deal with any of the things we conventionally deal with. Communication, resonance, telepathy is the sharing of an idea. Whatever an idea is, we think of it as kind of a space-time pattern and an extended thing. This is a cognitive strategy, basically.
Or a feeling. Telepathy is literally distant feeling, telepathy.
Yeah. I don't really see quantum mechanics being very useful.
No, but you see, then we can't have a situation where either we have to pick existing quantum mechanics or we have to have traditional mechanical models.
Yeah.
And the ideal situation would be a field model that can pick and mix these different metaphors in a new way.
Well, maybe the best thing is to just give up trying to anchor it to the vocabulary of quantum physics and to invent a vocabulary of macro physical fields.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
We
Well,
think of a probability wave associated to a bird, another probability wave associated to another bird, and then collapsing the wave functions with the integration operator and the Dirac delta of the two. I don't know. I think
well, then, I mean, the idea of morphic fields, as I see, is more. It's not a fully articulated model. It's a kind of word or a phrase that can cover a host of possible models. It's like a hope for a field, a hope for
yes, its success, metaphorically speaking, depends on a certain amount of fuzziness.
Yes. Now, if someone comes along and say, okay, we've got a perfect model for these things, we call it superconnectionism or whatever, that's fine by me. I mean, it just doesn't have to be called a field, but unless you have the idea there's something there.
Why not call it something like the vocabulary that associates with the Bell field or the Bell phenomenon? Call it a dimension of coextensive connectivity.
Well, that's not the term they use. I mean, that would be introducing sort of rather Whiteheadian type language. And for most people, the hypothesis of coextensive connectivity is rather too much. It would be called CC or something. It would soon be abbreviated because it's too much of a mouthful. You could call it anything. I mean, it's partly, it may be good to have a completely new name for it, but that new name would have to, I think I quite often use the word connectivity now, or interconnection, because that's what it's about. But it's not just an interconnection in space, but in time.
So a connectionist model is sort of the simplest. It doesn't capture all the phenomena, but it's very easy to think about. And
it's the rubber band approach.
Yes, the nodes connected by the rubber bands, and you can flip one and the message will go down.
Yes, well, I like that. I mean, I use the rubber band metaphor a lot.
And then there's another level up where each individual has a vibrating halo or something, which may extend to infinity but gets thinner as it goes out, and then the different halos move around, and their communication has to do with a morphic resonance, as it were, in the overlap of these halos, and that is more complicated and a higher level model. And from a halo model with this vibrating nimbus around each head, you could then collapse down to a connectionist model that would be like a simpler representation of some of the information in the nimbic model.
I like that, the nimbic model.
Well, I have a whole nimbic theory, in my a paper on angels, on the physics of angels, but I didn't call it that.
There's a Catholic order called the Knights of St. Nimbus.
Is that?
And in the representation of angels of the Renaissance painters, you see that that's where the word nimbus is used. That this golden circle around the head, no matter from what angle you look, you will always see the entire globe behind the head, so that the halo cannot possibly be a disc, like a graduation hat. It's not like a disc. It looks like a disc. Sometimes it's conical, it's an elliptical thing, but the only physical object that you could imagine that would appear as it appears in the paintings of Renaissance painters would be a spherical globe around the head which appears gold only when seen from the inside, and therefore more any angle you look, you see the front hemisphere of the nimbus as transparent, and the back hemisphere of it as golden.
I see. So you've worked out the physics of the nimbus.
Yes. But as seen by
quite an
Renaissance
advance.
painters.
Yes.
Yes, well, you look at these things and you don't think. It's quite forgivable because we don't spend too much time looking at angels.
No.
But the wings, I noticed that the sections are elliptical, and that means when they flap them, they're making circles. And well, it's not the physics, honestly. It's the geometry of angels.
I see, but I wish I'd known this earlier, because in the next edition of the Physics of Angels, maybe we should have a geometrical appendix.
Yes.
The geometry of the nimbus, the flapping of the circular motion of the wings,
Yes,
and so on. And the mechanics of the seraphim with its 6 wings. I don't know whether that features in your...
No, well, I have
The
an
tetramorph.
unpublished extrapolation to, what's it called?
Tetramorph.
The tetramorph?
The ones are those the ones with 4 wings.
Yes.
Oh, I see. I was thinking of the 4 angels facing in the 4 directions, and their wings are hitched, and Ezekiel
No,
saw
that
the
may
wheel way up.
actually be the real meaning of the tetramorph.
I think so.
I think
So yes, we do have, yes, it generates 6 dimensions. Well, this is another story. I stopped sending my papers around published on paper, and the papers actually became NIMBY. I mean, what do you call it? Well, pages on the World Wide Web. But you don't read papers on the World Wide Web, so therefore you never receive. Maybe I should send you a copy of the Geometry of Angels.
Yes, maybe a physical hard copy would be a good thing to have. Yes.
Okay.
Well, Terence doesn't, although he's constantly on the web, he doesn't give signs of instant recognition of his geometrical model.
True. Well, we only write. We do not read. We do not have time to read other people's pages because we're so busy writing our own. It's an occupational hazard being an author. There's no time to read.
So in terms of field theories, there's another kind that you haven't mentioned so far, but which is the hydrodynamical fields.
Yes.
Now, how do they compare with all these other kinds of fields?
Well, the hydrodynamic field is very similar to the electromagnetic field, but because fluids move and the electromagnetic field doesn't move, then you have your choice with say shallow waterways. I'm standing on the bank of the cliff, I'm looking down at the beach, and I see these waves are coming along. So I can think either of the water is standing still, which it is actually, molecules of water are going, moving up and down vertically only, and then they're coordinated in such a way as if pulling and pushing on their neighbors so that a wave goes along. So that's a Earth-centered coordinate system, as it were. Or you could ride along the wave. Then the mathematical description is somehow simpler because 3 feet ahead of you is lower, and 3 feet behind you is lower, and you're at the top of a wave. So you move along like surfers do on the crest of the wave. Geometry is fixed. It's not moving along. And
So your framework moves with it.
that's called the co-moving frame. So coordinates are good. It's the most basic thing in mathematical modeling is coordinates. You know, there was an extensive geometry of conic sections along with Apollonius, very good, complete. All we know of conic sections was known to Apollonius, but it was very difficult and became simple when the idea of coordinate systems was abstracted from Renaissance painters by Descartes and turned into a cognitive strategy based on rulers and so on. So the coordinate frame is the basis of everything, and even if you don't think of a material field, like quantum mechanics has the coordinate frame anyway. I think that this hydrodynamics is good because it forces you to have 2 different coordinate frames, one moving relative to the other. In the 3-body problem, for example, you have the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon. The Moon is considered sort of half of what's called restricted 3-body problem. The Moon is infinitesimally light compared to the Earth and the Sun. So the convenient coordinate system is like this. You draw a line between the Earth and the Sun, Then you measure along it until you get to the place where it balances, the center of mass. This might be actually inside the sun. And then you have to take the coordinate grid and you attach it to that line with the origin, the center at that point, and make it rotate around. So in that coordinate system, there is no rotation of the Earth and the Sun. The Sun is fixed a little bit away from the origin. The Earth is fixed way out there. In this coordinate plane, you then let the Moon move. And then that's the simplest model is the one that William of Ockham likes, and the one in which Newton proved Kepler's laws. So a coordinate is the most basic thing when mathematics is going to be used for anything. It's not a symbol, a form of logic and so on. It's the coordinate grid in which you measure something. What do you measure? Well, the aggressiveness of the gander, or the submissiveness of the goose, or whatever. You're measuring things in a coordinate grid. Where the members of the family are placed in the family field, there the word field is sort of referring to the coordinate grid, which is the stage on which the actors are placed, together with perhaps some attributes at different places, like the temperature varies from place to place. In case you took the temperature only of the individual birds or the actors in the family or something, then temperature would only be measurable in certain places in the coordinate grid, and there would be no measurements elsewhere. And then that's when you get into more or less quantum mechanics tries to deal with this, that you don't have continuous functions representing particles or just discontinuity. So you think them at a point with attributes. The probability wave is sort of the attribute of a point. They have different parts moving around. They have different waves. They're moving relative to each other and maybe even ignorant of each other. Nothing is more basic than the coordinate grid.
So do we have a wrap on this?
Yes. Well, do we have... so do we conclude that it's possible to build models of fields starting from this hydrodynamic? Is the best starting point, in your opinion, then this hydrodynamical system?
Well, if mathematics is going to be at all helpful in this area of the family field, and thus if it's to be all helpful in the context of psychic tests or any of the other experiments, we have a mathematical model for the observations of any experiment, then it's necessary to choose a simplest case because it's already complicated enough. And then it's essential to have data. When Bob Lane, the psychiatrist, came to being wanted by chaos theory in his practice, you have to get some numerical data. Well, I don't know if ufologists and anthropologists have very much numerical data, but that would be the start.
And the wish to mathematicize psychology generally is not a wish to make people healthier or happier. It's a wish to make psychology more respectable as a science. Mm-hmm. It's not clear it's a healthy trend at all, though it's been pursued furiously for nearly a century. The more successful psychoanalytic theories, it seems to me, if we could offer counter data, are the least mathematically driven and depend really on this mysterious business that we call the gifted therapist. The gifted therapist is not a mathematically defined entity. Psychology would love to be a science, but perhaps at the expense of the client base it's supposed to serve, which are pathological and neurotic human beings.
Well, the Gestalt psychologists came up with extensive field theories in the 1930s and 40s.
But little mathematics.
I think what we're talking about, the family field, they have a growing mathematical model, which I think personally is quite promising for the future of psychology in terms of its potential usefulness in dealing with world problems and so on. I think it's very important developments, like models for the arms race and for family conflicts and specific strategies for conflict resolution. These actually might be effective strategies evolved for the first time thanks to mathematical modeling is a possibility that can't be ruled out. So I think it's a valuable exercise that we should try to develop a mathematical modeling for family fields, and particularly in families of birds where there's extensive data. And it would be great to find a synthetic, up-to-date modern ethologist who knew of the existence in the literature of actual numerical data from experiments measured with comparable to your experiments with videotapes where we count how many times in an hour the dog goes to the window.
Yes, so data, we need more data, but we won't get more data unless people have the idea that it's worth trying to model.
That's the hermeneutics of science.
And we need more data in several areas. One, anthropology, where, in fact, a lot of classical anthropology involves those kinship structures of circles and triangles and those kind of family tree. A lot of it actually does have models of the social structure. That's what they've concentrated on in social anthropology, classical British social anthropologies of that kind. So there's that data. Then there's data from ethology, and there could be more if quantitative ethology could be done if people had a model to guide them in what they do. Hellinger's work could be extended to classify different kinds of fields and look at those of different cultural groups. If you ask lots of Indians and Chinese, you could do that. So these are all empirical ways of approaching it. Yes, and that seems to be the only way forward. Especially
mathematical modeling is one question, and the efficacy of it, and then the other is specifically field modeling.
You're going to have to
I'm going to have to go.